Hey friends, it's Just the Gems, and I'm choosing violence today, apparently, because I want to compare two of the biggest JRPG franchises and make qualitative judgments about them. And doing that is basically posting a giant invitation for people to unalive me in the comments. Yeah, I know, I said unalive, and if that bothers you, I get it, but you'll have to take it up with the algorithm. But seriously, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy were for a long time two titans locked in combat with each other in the JRPG arena. At least in Japan, they were. Over here, Dragon Quest's presence was much more muted. But now Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest are under one roof at Square Enix, and we're getting our hands on each and every game that comes out. So we're in a much better place to have these sorts of conversations now. Naturally, some of you are going to disagree with my takes, and I hope you'll let me know your thoughts down in the comments. In as much of a non-unaliving way as possible, if you don't mind. Please. Dragon Quest is sometimes called the first console JRPG ever, and while that's debatable, it definitely was the first console JRPG I ever played. I've talked before about how mind-blowing it was for me as a second grader who was used to side-scrolling platformers to suddenly find myself in this giant world full of towns and mountains and caves and forests. It's funny to look at it now and imagine being that blown away by it, but I can still conjure up those feelings, and they're very real. Final Fantasy, on the other hand, was more of a response to Dragon Quest. DQ fired the first shots, and FF shot back. Their first entry added layers of complexity over the baseline established by Dragon Quest. Instead of a lone hero going out to kill the Dragon Lord, you were a party of 4 heroes with different skills, and your mission at first is the slightly vaguer, restore light to the orbs. Dragon Quest's story never evolved beyond its initial premise, whereas Final Fantasy becomes a time-traveling romp against goblins and robots and archfiends. But even though Final Fantasy is obviously very beloved in Japan, it could never take the place of Dragon Quest. And this is due in part to Dragon Quest's insistence on maintaining its traditions. Which brings me to the central argument of this video. Dragon Quest versus Final Fantasy is really a conversation about consistency versus risk-taking. For the most part, at least. It's not as if Dragon Quest never took any risks, and it's not as if Final Fantasy never had consistent elements. But in a broad and sweeping perspective, those are the two paths that those series chose to follow. Visually, the first 3 or 4 entries in each series look pretty much the same between games. There weren't a ton of options when it came to color choice and pixel placement on the NES. But if we zoom back a bit, we can see the disparity between the series widen as time goes on. First and foremost, Dragon Quest is defined by the artwork of Akira Toriyama. His style imbues everything in the series with a sort of whimsy that's pretty unique among JRPGs. Having Toriyama as the character and monster designer really established the look of Dragon Quest, to the point that by the modern era, the evolution of the graphics from sprites to 3D models just feels natural. In our minds, we were always seeing the characters looking like the heroes from Dragon Quest XI. Technology just hadn't caught up to Toriyama's vision yet. It'll be interesting to see where the series goes in the future with the passing away of Toriyama, whether they try and imitate his style with other artists or pull in a drastically different direction. Now, Final Fantasy, on the other hand, has never had a truly established style. Yeah, the first 6 games had character work by Yoshitaka Amano, and it's truly gorgeous art. However, that art has never been well realized within a game itself. And if I can don the guise of a pretentious art critic, if I'm being blunt, a lot of his characters just look the same as each other. Right? I'm not the only one who sees that. They're all super pale and blonde. It's pretty, in a way, but seeing his art has never made me feel Final Fantasy, if that makes sense. Starting with Final Fantasy VII, Tetsuya Nomura took over character designs, giving us characters that A, had a lot of belts, and B, looked much more like their models in-game. But he wouldn't be the sole designer. Others would step in for certain games, like Akihiko Yoshida in Final Fantasy XII. This experimentation and variety led Final Fantasy to sort of lack an easily definable look, so to speak. Even beyond the characters, the environments cover a much wider spectrum than Dragon Quest, which is pretty much swords and sorcery and dragons, almost without exception. From Final Fantasy VI's steampunk to Final Fantasy VII's futuristic aesthetic to Final Fantasy XIII's whatever the hell that is. Most of the games after the first 5 entries have been extremely different from each other. The aesthetics of the 2 series can be summed up pretty simply by colorful and dark. Sure, some of the earlier Final Fantasies could be seen as somewhat more colorful and bright games, but as the series has progressed, the worlds have gotten darker and drearier. Dragon Quest has always maintained its Toriyama-style brightness and cheer. And not to say that horrible things don't happen in Dragon Quest games, but everything has a cartoony veneer that takes some of the edge off, at least in my opinion. This division of consistency and risk-taking carries over into the gameplay as well. Dragon Quest has definitely had its moments of innovation within its combat systems, but for the most part, we've seen a consistent, straightforward turn-based style from every mainline game in the series. Outside of the mainline, other entries explore different sorts of combat styles, but I'm focusing just on the mainline series, so keep that in mind before you comment. Although you can still comment about it, that's fine. Engagement is engagement. Go nuts. Anyway, Final Fantasy is a mixed bag when it comes to risk-taking. The first 3 entries are turn-based. The next 6 use the active time battle system, where enemies no longer have to wait for you to choose your commands in battle. The next game returns to turn-based with a twist. The game after that is an MMO. The one after that is an MMO, but not multiplayer and not online. And the one after that is... I could go on, but suffice to say, every single Final Fantasy has drastically reinvented its combat system from 10 onward. All the way to the point of Final Fantasy XVI being a straight-up action game. It doesn't get riskier than that, changing up your genre mid-series, does it? To be fair, Dragon Quest did introduce MMO gameplay in Dragon Quest X and some multiplayer aspects in 9, but for the most part, right, it's been pretty consistent. So, what do I prefer here in terms of the aesthetics and the battle systems? Honestly, it's kind of split for me. I really appreciate the Final Fantasy series for mixing it up so much visually and in terms of its worlds, but there's something comforting about starting up a new Dragon Quest game and basically already knowing how to play it. You know what I mean? There are new elements in each DQ, but those are just in addition to the combat basics, which have been largely unchanged since the very first game. So if we're keeping score, that's 1 point to Dragon Quest for the consistency of its battle systems, and 1 point to Final Fantasy for the variety in its art and world design. Now, either both camps of players are pleased and satisfied, or both are super angry at me. Maybe a combination of both. This was probably a mistake. Now let's talk about the music. Koichi Sugiyama was the composer for the Dragon Quest series from the time it began until he passed away in 2021. And there is basically no soundtrack more iconic. Hearing almost any piece of music from a Dragon Quest game, whether done up in chiptune style or with a full orchestra, you immediately recognize it as Dragon Quest. If any video game series has a signature style of music, it's DQ. Final Fantasy started out in a similar vein, though Nobuo Uematsu may have taken a few more risks in his compositions. There's a consistency in his vision throughout the first 9 Final Fantasy games. The subsequent games have different composers, and honestly, there hasn't been a bad Final Fantasy soundtrack ever, but for sheer consistency of style and quality, I'm gonna give a slight edge to Dragon Quest here. Oh, hey, real quick. Sorry to interrupt. Before we continue, can I ask, if you're enjoying this so far, would you click like? And there's a very good chance that you're not subscribed, so if you wouldn't mind clicking subscribe too, if you aren't already, it really helps me out so much and makes it easier for me to keep making videos. Psychologically, you know. Thanks so much. Okay, back to it. The next big category I want to look at is protagonists. There have been some enormous names in the JRPG main character space over the years. Terra, Cloud, Zidane, Lightning, Noctis, Butts. Butts. You might have noticed a strong bias in that list. Yes, Butts. Those are all Final Fantasy protagonists, not a single Dragon Quest main character in sight. The reason for that is Dragon Quest doesn't really have a main character. Now, before you come at me, give me a chance to explain what I mean. Dragon Quest games have a world. They have characters, they have a story, but they don't have a protagonist. Not really. What they have instead is a space for you to occupy. The main character in a Dragon Quest game might have something of a backstory, they might even have family and people who know them. But for all intents and purposes, they are not characters in and of themselves. They are the roughest outline of a character, a sketch of a person designed specifically to not participate in the story in the hopes that you will. By keeping the protagonist slot empty, essentially, the idea is that you'll feel like you're a participant in the story. In theory, I understand that idea, and I can even appreciate it. It's drawn from the same place as a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. You create and embody a character for the length of the story being told. Where Dragon Quest and games with silent protagonists in general tend to fail is by neglecting to give us meaningful choices. In Western RPGs, you'll often find silent protagonists. However, Western RPGs are much more driven by choice, and your character can often shape the course of the story by the choices you make. Dragon Quest, on the other hand, has crafted a narrative that it sticks closely to, with some exceptions, like Dragon Quest V's marriage choices. Within this tight narrative, you have no wiggle room, but thou must, and the game won't proceed until you say yes. By removing the element of choice from the game, the silent protagonist serves no purpose. They're treated by the rest of the cast as though they are a real person, but you, the person who's supposed to be embodying them, have no say in what transpires. It's a missed opportunity, and an example of a Dragon Quest tradition that the series appears to be sticking to purely for the sake of tradition. Final Fantasy, on the other hand, gives its protagonists distinct personalities, specific histories, particular likes and dislikes. They make friends, they fall in love, they have their own reasons for hating the villains. You are on the journey with them. The game doesn't pretend that you can somehow literally embody them. Look, if you've been around my channel before, you probably already know how I feel about the silent protagonist thing. The fact that it's a tradition doesn't help Dragon Quest out in this instance. That's a clear point for Final Fantasy. The stories are another area of huge division. It's hard to make an objective statement about something as subjective as a story, but the element of risk-taking inherent in the Final Fantasy formula tends to lead to, if nothing else, a much wider variety of stories than Dragon Quest. Even setting aside the worlds of the various games, the plots in Final Fantasy are frequently darker and twistier. They typically have better and more interesting villains, and they go to some incredibly out there places. I tend to prefer Final Fantasy stories over Dragon Quest, so it seems like that would be an easy point to award to Final Fantasy. But Dragon Quest complicates things by having some entries that are just absolute masterclasses in storytelling and characters. Dragon Quest XI is one of my favorite JRPG stories, period, and Dragon Quest V is still talked about for its innovation in storytelling to this day. Final Fantasy definitely takes more big swings, but because of this, they do tend to strike out more than Dragon Quest. Final Fantasy VIII's story is famously difficult to follow and relies a little too much on convenient amnesia and other gimmicks that kind of rob it of poignancy. Final Fantasy V took all the interesting character work that happened in Final Fantasy IV and set it aside in favor of a relatively bland entry that had admittedly some of the best gameplay in the series' history. Final Fantasy XIII's story is almost incomprehensible if you're not willing to invest hours into reading the in-game encyclopedia so you can fully understand its world. Final Fantasy XV, despite being one of my personal favorites, is criticized, arguably rightly, for not telling its complete story upon its original launch and having to fill in gaps with DLC. I could go on, but I think you get the point. Now, name an outright stinker in the Dragon Quest series. One that the majority of players agree is terrible. You probably can't. And that's down to their consistency. I still feel like this is a point that I have to give to Final Fantasy though, and that's because despite its batting record, when it hits big. If Dragon Quest players take comfort in the traditions they know are going to be carried over from game to game, Final Fantasy players have to gird themselves up for what might be a bumpy ride. But when everything clicks into place, there's no experience like it. A good Final Fantasy story like 6 or 7 or 9, in my mind, they blow most Dragon Quest stories out of the water in terms of their impact. So that's that. Honestly, I'm framing this as these two series in head-to-head combat, but at the end of the day, they're both fantastic in their own ways. My ranking shows that I have a preference for Final Fantasy overall, but that in no way lessens how much I enjoy Dragon Quest. Some people are going to value certain aspects of these games more than I do, so it's not strange at all if you have a very different opinion. Speaking of different opinions, let me and everyone else know yours down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you. And until next time, bye.